What's up, everybody? Welcome into DodgerHeads, presented by DodgerBlue.com, part of the Medium Large Sports Network. My name is Jeff Spiegel, joined today by another Jeff Pontes of Baseball America, here to talk Dodger prospect rankings. Jeff, we appreciate the time. It's nice to have another Jeff on the show, so thanks for being.
Yeah, switching up the style of Jeff too. I'm the East Coast Jeff with the traditional G name from the old days in Europe. I actually, funny enough, I'm from Massachusetts. My grandmother grew up in Brooklyn. Was the only member of my family that liked baseball, so I actually cheered for the Dodgers growing up, and I can back this up with multiple Dodger hat pictures throughout my youth that have been posted on the internet. So I am from Massachusetts, but I didn't grow up a Red Sox fan. I actually grew up a Dodgers fan. So
I love it. I love it. Well, I'm excited to chat with you. I love talking about prospects and farm systems. That might be because I'm a Dodgers fan and we typically are rated out well on these type of lists. But before we dive into where specific guys are, Roki Sasaki, all that kind of stuff, let's just start with, you and I were chatting right before we came on. Baseball America has a slightly different process for how they arrive at their top 100 list than Baseball Prospectus, who we've had Jarrett Seidler on, and as well as some other lists people might read. So give me the quick overview for people that are unfamiliar with the differences between your lists.
Yeah, so the process really starts sort of at the end of the summer, as we start to combine scouting notes and information that we're getting from contacts. Throughout the season, it could be in-person conversations, it could be scout calls, front office calls, just a couple of texts about a given player, but just combining all of that reporting and all that note taking and information that we get throughout the year. We've also been lucky enough to have some contacts that have provided us advanced StatCast data over the last couple of years. So not only do we have it for a given year, we also have it going all the way back to 2019, which gives us a really good idea of historical context of certain skills and attributes, and just across the board to be able to measure that in a real way. We then sort of combine that. We work through the top 30s. Really, the top 10s get released, in the early winter, late fall, kind of up to Christmas. In the background, we're working on the top 30s. I had, 5 different teams. Unfortunately, the Dodgers weren't one of mine, but, I'm not senior enough to have snagged that one yet. That's Josh Norris that does the list. But we all do work together. Those top 30s go into the handbook. We ship that out, and, we take a couple weeks off, and we come back in the new year. We start working on the top 100. We take those top 30s, we combine them all. We have obviously grades and risk. The way that our system works is we have a point deduction for each sort of risk threshold against the overall roll grade. So let's say somebody's a 55 extreme. Extreme is a negative 15. So that, makes him a 40 sort of score, right?
Got it.
Which a guy who's a 50 high, a high is a negative 10. He's sort of the same score. So that's why we can have a 50 ahead of a 55. And really, it's just about risk. And usually you're going to see that with players who are a little bit further off are going to have a little bit more risk. So if you're ranking a 19-year-old kid who's only had, experience in the complex, he's got more risk than a guy who's had 2 or 3 years and has been productive in the upper minors. So it's just a way to sort of balance that, but also come up with a score that allows us to rank all those guys. So we then put that list together. We sort of rank it a little bit off our personal preferences. We try to stay in line and not contradict any of the top 10s or the top 30s. We then go through the list. We kind of talk through it as a team. It's probably 5 or 6 of us on this. It's myself, it's JJ Cooper, it's Josh Norris, Jesus Cano, who just joined us from MLB, is now part of our prospect team. Of course, Ben Badler, of course, Carlos Collazo, Matt Eddy, and all the veterans that you guys have been reading for many, many years on the site. We then work through that list. We come up with a top 150, more or less, and we then send it out to as many front office and contacts as we can throughout the game, especially, more front office higher ups, because they have a better global perspective as opposed to someone who's maybe just assigned to a given team. We've already worked through those sort of scouts on the pro side or analysts on the pro side that are focused on certain teams through the top 30 process, because they know intimately each one of those systems, and then we kind of rank it all together. So our goal when we put together the top 100, but really the top 30s as well, is it's not our opinion. It's just more of at least what our goal is to be more reflective of the industry and the feedback we're getting, and try to remove our own personal biases from it. And I think it works because we kind of have all of this cross-checking going on throughout the process. We're cross-checking each other. We're getting cross-checked on our own opinions, maybe by scouts in the top 30 process. And then ultimately, when we put out that big list, we're sending it out to a bunch of teams. And as you would imagine, there are some players that have move up feedback or move down feedback universally. There's a lot of guys where, within the game, the opinions on a given prospect can be really split.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. And that's why it's helpful. The reason I ask is because I know a lot of people are going to look at the Baseball America list, the Baseball Prospectus list, the Athletics list, Fangraphs list, and be like, well, wait a minute. Why is Zaire Hope 8th on one list and 70th on the other? And it's, in talking to lots of people, part of it is the balance, like you said, between what the ceiling of a guy is versus the certainty. And some places are more willing to take on the risk and say, we're just going to bet on the ceiling. Other places, you have a guy like Alex Freeland, who we'll talk about, who I don't think anybody would argue has the ceiling of a lot of the other guys maybe around him on the list, but the floor is probably a lot higher, and it's probably way less of a risk compared to some other guys. So it's helpful to know kind of as we dive in. But let's start with the top. There's a gentleman by the name of Roki Sasaki that I understand has signed with the Dodgers. Let me ask you this first. There is debate in the world that you live in about whether or not Roki Sasaki belongs on lists like this or does not. He is technically Rookie of the Year eligible, which is how most people view the list. I'm guessing it's why you have him on the list. There are other people who would say guys coming over from the KBO NPB should not be on these lists. Part of it to me is like, I don't know how much this actually matters, but I'm just curious the process that you guys went through to say Roki Sasaki is going to be on this list.
So we have previously always ranked farm professionals. We kind of this year put a line in the sand because of the PPI component of this that, we're part of the lists that impact which players and which teams could potentially get a pick. Now, Roki Sasaki did not sign as a foreign professional the way Yamamoto had the previous year. We had made the decision last year not to rank Yamamoto. The difference is Yamamoto was essentially a free agent, which most of the KBO guys tend to be that too. They're not coming over here that early. So when you look at someone like that, it's like, all right, well, that guy could just sign for as many years for as big of a contract as he possibly can. Roki Sasaki is going through the same team control and then arbitration process that any prospect is going to go through. So because he falls under that threshold, we will still rank those guys. But, Hee-Sung Kim, who, you guys signed out of Korea, was not ranked. And that's because he was older. He wasn't, under the bonus pool rules of the international market. He was just a free agent signing. So that's sort of how we differentiate between it. I think the other thing too is if like we had just been ranking the best prospects in the world the last 3 years, Sasaki probably would have been number one on the list.
Okay.
I think he definitely would have been number one on the list. He certainly would have been ranked ahead of Skeens. I think that's kind of flipped in the last year as Skeens has taken a huge step forward, added a 80 off-speed pitch we didn't know he had at LSU, and Sasaki slid back a little bit in terms of command and just power on his fastball and his pitch mix. So I still think that, he's one of the elite prospects in the game. And at the end of the day, I don't think any of us turned in a list where Sasaki wasn't one. So that's why we ranked him and sort of why we ranked him one. There's not a lot of guys that are going to walk into, the big leagues day one, not spend a minute in the minors and, join arguably, the best team that we've seen player for player, probably since some of those Yankees teams at the early 2000s or something, just in terms of star power, name value, experience. And then, they obviously, some of these guys have won multiple times in LA now. Right.
Yeah.
So, I think, ultimately that's why we did it. I can't speak for others why they wouldn't rank him. I guess like if he's a professional, yada, 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 but all these guys are getting paid, it's not like, the NPB to MLB, equivalency is equal. It's certainly not. So I mean, there's a lot there. And I just think when you look at a guy who throws 100 miles an hour when he's right, has an elite sort of ghost fork ball splitter, and then, an organization that can probably get the best breaking ball shape out of him, which is the biggest question.
You kind of hinted at this already. My follow-up was going to be, how does he compare to previous number one prospects on this list? I think I was reading, is it right that the Orioles had the number one guy on your list 3 straight years prior to this one?
Yes.
With Rutschman, Gunnar Henderson, and Jackson Holiday.
Yeah.
You mentioned Paul Skeens. Like, is Sasaki, maybe this is a weird way of asking, like, is he an average number one overall prospect? Would you say he's like one of the better number one overall prospects, one of the worst? Where would you place him?
Well, he's certainly, I would say him and Roman Anthony, I would have, who's our number 2 and was really our number 1 prior to Sasaki signing. I would have him, in my opinion, over Holiday. I think both of those guys just have more going at Holiday. I was a little lower on Holiday than others coming into the year. I think when you look at Gunnar, I would still have Sasaki above how I viewed Gunnar. I think him and Roman Anthony, just in terms of skills, is pretty close. Gunnar maybe gets the edge because he can play shortstop, and Anthony's kind of a right fielder, probably long term. Then you start to get to some of the guys like Acuna. The year that we had Adley, Bobby Witt Jr., and Julio Rodriguez at the top of the list.
Pretty good list.
Yeah, I think that he can compare to those guys. We kind of got to see it. It wouldn't be outrageous to look back in 5 years and be like, the Dodgers figured out this in terms of the slider, and Sasaki took a huge step forward and is a top 5 pitcher in the game. I think you can then look at, like, Acuna was ranked above Ohtani. It was 1-2 with Acuna and Ohtani. I don't think he's that level of prospect. Close, but when you're talking about Acuna and Ohtani, we also have like the hindsight 2020 here, where we're like, those guys are pretty incredible. Those are MVP players. And I don't know if Sasaki gets to that point where he wins an MVP. I do think he's going to be a multi-time all-star. I think that there is, Hall of Fame potential here, which is kind of what you're looking at when you're ranking these top, 1 or 2 guys on this top 100 list. It's like, it's not just, is this guy going to be a star? Is he going to be good in MLB? It's like, can he be elite? Can he be somebody that, like, your kid has a jersey of throughout his life and emulates them in the batter's box or on the mound? I think he's got that ability, but I wouldn't put him out there. I think he's kind of a higher mid-tier number 1 overall prospect. And I think that can be proven to be maybe too conservative in a couple of years if he has some big years and the Dodgers do what they do with pitching development.
The rest of the guys on the list, Rushing, Freeland, Josue DePaula, Zaire Hope, Jackson Ferris, in that order. I'd love to sit here and go through every one of these guys, as well as some guys who missed the list. We don't have time for that. I'm curious for you, when you think about the reporting on these guys, some of the stuff that you've heard, maybe your own personal thoughts. I'll let you kind of take a pick on if there's 1 or 2 of those 5 guys that you maybe have strong feelings about.
Yeah. I think, for me, I am a big Zaire Hope advocate. You can go back and read some of our early season sort of breakdowns of players who are really popping on the data and the information. This is prior to his injury. He came out the gate, like, really showing big tools, big stuff. The balance with him is, it's kind of similar to Gunnar. It's kind of similar to Roman Anthony, where huge EVs, like, his numbers are, 108, 109, 90th percentile type EVs, but he doesn't swing and miss in the zone. It's 13, 14% in zone miss rate, which is like a 70 grade if we're going to put, like, numbers, scouting numbers on actual numbers. Doesn't chase out of the zone very much. When he does chase, he will miss a little bit. Pretty good athlete. I was telling you a story ahead of time where, I knew the cross checker with the Cubs that signed him, and going to see him for the first time. And, the area guy, after he had gone through a BP round before a game, had kind of went over and chatted with him and said, like, hey, do the thing. And he did a standing backflip. Like, he's just kind of a freaky athlete. He is kind of built like Maurice Jones-Drew. He's like a shorter, stocky, explosive kind of a guy. So I think, like, you could see that body, and especially from a baseball perspective, where we're not used to, like, these explosive, stocky bodies like you see in football constantly, right? Like, those guys are in defensive backfields or running backs all over the place. So the best athletes probably in America. Those guys don't play baseball. They end up in the SEC as running backs, right? We've seen this before. So I think, like, for me, the guy that I'm most excited about is Zaire Hope. If I had done my own personal, like, Geoff Pontes bias list, I would probably have him. I don't think I'd have him above Rushing because I think Rushing is a ready-made ball player. I think he's one of the best bats in the minors. He's in AAA. He can play multiple positions. Maybe not great, but it's pretty tough for me to write that off. I think they're probably pretty close. I think they're both, in my opinion, top 25 prospects. And Rushing, I think, like, if you've seen Rushing on the Cape when he was with Louisville, kind of prior to him breaking out, the bat speed was the first thing that sticks out to you. I mean, it's just elite bat speed, and there's not a lot of guys with that sort of impact and bat speed that also make consistent contact, make good swing decisions. It's the kind of bat speed where he could get away with a lot of bad habits, but he kind of didn't have those. The big question has always been the defensive position, and I think that based on the feedback, the Dodgers have coaxed out, a little bit more ability, whether it's in the outfield and maybe even some chance that he can catch a little bit on off days when they need it. The other guy that I'll call out that I saw toward the end of the year was Josue DePaula in high A. Had just made an adjustment and a swing change. It was in like mid-August. And I can remember sitting there, kind of eavesdropping as Gasparino was actually behind me, not knowing who I was at all. And they were talking about how they had worked with him and then Geloff on some swing changes and some stuff to just get the ball more consistently in the air. Geloff had a huge series. DePaula hit the ball really well. The big question with DePaula for me is, can he learn how to defend in the outfield? Because it's pretty bad.
Okay.
His profile in some ways kind of reminds me of, this sounds worse now than it would have sounded at the time, of like Eloy Jimenez, where it's a bat first, outfielder. I think he's a better athlete than Jimenez is. I mean, Jimenez is probably one of the worst corner outfielders I've ever seen. He's not that bad, but it's like a 45 in a corner that you're like, if he can get to an average level, he's a left fielder. He's going to hit. And the underlying metrics and ability there in terms of, he's a really advanced bat to ball guy, really advanced swing decisions. He's not going to chase. He's not going to span the zone. It's always going to be a great at bat. And the organization has kind of slowly coaxed him along of just getting a little bit more loft in the swing and, getting to those EVs that are there, but maybe getting a little bit more into, airborne pull side contact, which, if you want to hit a lot of home runs, you got to be able to pull the ball to the pull side in the air. That's the easiest way to get the ball out of the ballpark. I don't care if you're, Mookie Betts or you're Freddie Freeman, right? Big body, small body, it doesn't really matter. There's certain guys that, can juice it the other way, and that's great. But to really optimize that, I think you need to get to that point. So that's kind of where he needs to go. Okay. But I think when you look at like pure hitting ability, right? DePaula has it in spades. And I think, he's an interesting story too. Like, I'm old, so I grew up watching Stephon Marbury. I know who Sebastian Telfair is. Those are his cousins.
Crazy.
He comes from super athletic family. He's an American kid. His first language is English. It's not Spanish. A Brooklyn guy that then, moved down to the Dominican Republic to then sign. So I think that's interesting too. And I think it's also good when you have some of these guys who are bilingual that can kind of be that bridge in the clubhouse between, the Hispanic contingent and the American contingent, and kind of coach guys along with language and all that sort of stuff. I think we sometimes forget as we look at a team like the Dodgers, where, like, how many different languages are spoken in that clubhouse?
It's crazy.
It's not like it was, even years ago, where it's just like guys from different parts of America. It's like you have guys from all different Latin American countries. You have guys from Korea and Japan. And, it's a really international game. So I think when you see somebody like this, he's just really unique. So I've been writing about DePaula a lot for the last few years. And, I'm interested to see the steps that he takes forward this year. I would imagine probably returning to high A and then, probably seeing Tulsa at Double A at some point during the summer.
Quick follow-up on Rushing, because I think this is one of the most interesting things, is the conversation about his defense, which you referenced. I think there's some people that believe he can play catcher, and the reason they've moved him off catcher is simply because there's not really a path to playing time there with Will Smith locked into the contract that he has with the Dodgers. I've also heard people suggest that the reason he's moving off catcher is because the outfield is maybe a better landing spot for him, regardless of the fact that Will Smith is necessarily in front of him. Do you land more in one of those camps than the other?
Yeah, I think, long term, he's probably an outfielder.
Okay.
See some time at first base. But I think the other thing that we're seeing here is a lot of organizations, particularly forward-thinking organizations, have embraced multi-position ability, and it allows you to do things with your lineup, and get in sort of the best bats and just the best overall impact team onto the field day in and day out. The Dodgers have certainly embraced that. I mean, we've even seen them move Mookie Betts, who is one of the better defensive outfielders in the game, back into the infield. And I think, you look at some of these other teams, the Rays, the Mariners, the Red Sox, all progressive teams that have really sort of pushed their guys to have sort of a secondary position or an area that they can cover up. It's going to create more opportunities. And I think ultimately that's sort of what his strength is that you could probably put him in the outfield consistently. That was where he'll see 60 to 70% of his opportunities, maybe plays a little bit of first base when needed. And then, in an emergency situation, you could put this guy in there and he can catch and he can handle his own. He's a below average catcher. That's not going to change. The arm is pretty good, not a great framer, but he is somebody that does have extensive experience back there. And we've seen guys get better. I was sitting with a scout who had played summer ball with Will Smith in the NECBL. It's not the Cape. It's sort of a league below that where a lot of underclassmen will go and guys that are learning different positions. I think they played together in Newport. He was a catcher. This guy works for a major league organization now as a scout. And he was saying, like, I played with Will Smith and he was terrible behind the plate. And now you're not seeing that. Like, that's the big thing with getting into professional organizations that have good coaching, that have specialists. They can get guys to a certain point where they can get a little bit better. So I was very skeptical of Rushing as a catcher when I saw him on the Cape, have been over the last couple of years. Throughout the handbook process, it was one of those things where it was like, don't shut the door on it entirely. He's never going to see 100 games behind the plate in a given season, but there's a chance that maybe he sees 30 to 40 in the right situations. And, he has that ability to fit in as sort of a multi-position guy. And honestly, when you're trying to get into a stacked Dodgers lineup, you just got to figure out where you can get in, right?
Yeah.
You got to figure out where you can get in. So I think that's a big part of it.
I love it. Those are the six guys, with Sasaki who are on the list. Looking at your top 10, some other guys in the top 10, Eduardo Quintero, Kellen Lindsay, Robleski, Joendry Vargas, and then River Ryan. You mentioned the small teas. The top 30 is coming out this week, I believe, for the Dodgers. So go ahead and check that out on Baseball America. But I'm curious for you. I mentioned some other names who are in the top. I guess it would be a top 11 now that Roki Sasaki is officially a Dodger. So the Dodger fans have 11 that they know already. They're ahead of the game. There's some interesting names. Quintero is a guy that it seems like maybe is a little bit higher on your list. And then you've got other guys like Emil Morales is not on this list as well. So I'm just take this wherever you want. Were there guys that were maybe close to the top 100 who were just outside of it, or guys that you personally liked or more skeptical of than others?
I would have probably been a little bit higher on Emil Morales. I would have to check with Josh just in terms of what the feedback is. It's just tough because you kind of look at some of these guys like Quintero ripped up the complex this year. Really exciting player that has hitting ability, but also like supporting tools. He's a plus runner. People believe he can be plus in center field. He has an above average arm, hits the ball really hard, does damage in games. It's like, it's hard to sort of overwrite that. Kellen Lindsay, obviously, athletic high school guy. We'll see where that goes. I might have been a little bit lower, but still, got some pretty good money in the draft. Robleski, we've seen him in the big leagues. River Ryan's another guy that we've seen in the big leagues.
Can we talk Robleski really quick? Because he's interesting to me because I don't think I don't know if I could find a Dodgers fan, and obviously River Ryan coming off injury, but that would have Robleski ranked here among some of the Dodger prospects. I mean, I've seen like his stuff is crazy and how hard he throws from the left side. But talk to me a little bit about maybe the feedback you guys have gotten on Robleski.
Yeah, I think, going back to when he was sort of a back end of the Dodgers list type of guy, he was somebody where it was consistently like, once this guy's healthy and he's throwing, like you're going to see something unique. Deep arsenal of pitches, commands the ball pretty well. And it's a pretty special fastball from the left side. There's not a lot of guys with sort of that movement profile and velocity and some of the release traits, which create deception. There's just not a lot of guys that do that. But I think you could probably say that, like, tier wise, he's kind of in the same tier as the guys that are ranked behind him.
Okay.
And maybe like Lindsay and even Quintero, I think Emil Morales probably easily could have been in the top 10. Another guy that I actually like a lot and I thought stuck out in terms of arms that I saw in the AFL, which is not kind of an oxymoron. You don't see a lot of those guys in the Arizona Fall League, was Eric Swan.
Yeah.
I think this is the next guy creeping in.
Jarrett Seidler just about lost his mind talking about Eric Swan on this show.
Yeah, the stuff is great. Haven't seen him. I actually saw him at that game where Zaire Hope hit that like 470-foot nuke in Goodyear, like over the batter's eye. And then it was like 2 innings later, Eric Swan comes in and you're like, whoa, we got another hot, Dodger guy here coming in. Smaller school guy. They did a really good job in terms of, as they always do. And I think this is what separates the Dodgers in terms of their identification process on the pitching side, is just looking at traits that they're like, we can optimize this. We can make this better. And I think like ultimately that's what makes him sort of a name that I would call out here as someone I think could definitely pop. If you want another sleeper,
that was going to be my last question. So just go there.
I'll save it for that. But yeah, if you want me to go in there now, I can give you a couple.
Go for it.
Brendan Tunick. So I have access to athletic testing from the draft. Post-draft, I have some access through contacts. And Tunick is a guy that was one of the best athletes in the draft, kind of under-scouted. And I know people that had turned him into certain other organizations where they kind of poo-pooed it. And then it was hilarious to see the Dodgers then pop that guy. And it was like, yep, you should have taken him. We knew this. So I think he's one to keep an eye on. It might be a slow burn, but I do think that there's, potentially big upside with Tunick. The other guy I'll call out is somebody that they acquired recently from the Reds, Mike Sirota. He's a local guy, played at Northeastern here, was on the Cape for a couple of summers, was drafted by the Dodgers out of high school. He went to a high school in New York, the Gunnery, that's pretty famous. Ended up on campus at Northeastern. Was kind of like a coup for them because it was like, this is a real recruit. And not that Northeastern is bad. They're always a pretty good school, but it's a mid-major. It's squarely a mid-major. They usually don't pull guys like this in. And for 2 years, he ripped. I think we entered the season or the last sort of draft cycle with him as a first rounder.
Yeah.
And then he struggled. He struggled out of the gate for a couple of months. And then finished really strong. So it kind of dropped him in draft rankings. It dropped him in the actual draft. And I think people kind of forgot. The Dodgers obviously really believe in this guy. They drafted him once. They then went and traded for him, right? So that tells me that there is some element of this kid's makeup, this kid's tool set that they really can turn into a good player. And I'm excited to see him sort of under that Dodgers tutelage as well, because they've been trying this now for 3 years, when they finally got their guy. So I think you can't discount that, right? We've seen time and time again, the Dodgers make really smart decisions, and it's really hard for me to just, go, he had a bad couple of months in Northeastern. I don't think that overwrites the skills he showed the first 2 years, the stuff that he showed in the Cape over the course of a couple of seasons. And then obviously the fact that the Dodgers are totally bought in this guy. Really interesting player, center field type, can hit. There's projectable power. There's some speed and tools. So he could be another exciting one. I don't think he's going to be like a top 50 prospect in the game or anything, but this could be like an Alex Freeland guy. Freeland was a guy that, stuck out as a switch hitter that could play a bunch of different positions. The underlying data was really good in his debut professional, like full season professional debut, but the numbers didn't match it. And then we saw once again, those numbers were more predictive than the slash line. And we saw him just, go gangbusters this year and take off like a rocket. So I would say Sirota would be, and Tunic are my two guys in the system that are outside the top 10 that I think you really need to pay attention to and just be aware of this season as you're watching your Dodgers affiliates.
I love it. I love it. I'm glad you mentioned Sirota because I would forgotten that he wasn't even in the organization when you guys started putting together this list. And so, again, Wednesday, the top 30 coming out over at Baseball America. Jeff, anything else over at BA that you want to plug?
Yeah, I mean, we got the top 25 for college. If you're a college baseball fan, that dropped over on the site today. We're going to have updated draft rankings coming out soon. Of course, if you're into reading about international prospects, we have Ben Badler on staff. There's just very few people that are even in his range. Maybe one or two people in the world that cover the international market as well as Ben does. He's got international breakdowns for all 30 teams linked on the site. You go in there, you can read, 5 or 6 scouting reports on the players that have signed internationally. I think that's really unique. There's not a lot of sites that are going to have that kind of information on all these players. When these guys sign, more often than not, they're either quoting Ben or Jesse Sanchez. So I think that's, something to go and check out. We got a ton. If you're into fantasy baseball, I'm involved with that a little bit. We have our full fantasy rankings up on the site, positional rankings, as well as like a full dynasty list. And then some, additional content on top of that. So really anything that touches baseball, baseball cards, whatever it is, we're covering it all at this point.
I love it. I love it. Well, that is Geoff Pontes. You can find him on social media at GeoffPontesBA. Jeff, we appreciate the time. We appreciate all the thought. And again, as Dodger fans, it's always fun for me to read these lists and to dive into some of these guys. So thanks again for coming on the show. And we'll have to have you, on as the season progresses. We'll follow along with a couple of your sleeper picks there. So everybody, we appreciate you watching. Again, this is Dodger Heads presented by DodgerBlue.com. Enjoy the rest of your day. And as always, go Dodgers.